It's sweet and spicy. It's cold, but oh so hot. Join me today as I show you how to make Cowboy candy. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and to make my Cowboy candy, I'm going to use my own jalapenos from the garden. Now you can get the jalapeno peppers from the store, but as with anything we make in our kitchen, I think it just tastes better when you grow your own and you use your own harvest. Today I'm harvesting a couple different types of jalapeno. My early jalapeno and Craig's grande jalapeno. With a bowl full of fresh jalapenos, let's head inside and make some candy. These beautiful jalapenos are washed, and now it's time to start making Cowboy candy, or candied jalapenos, because that's what it is. We're going to take sugar and vinegar and turn these jalapenos into a preserved sweet product. Now, the ingredients are pretty standard, and you're going to see this across YouTube when you look for a video on how to make Cowboy candy. But my process is going to be a little bit different than what the others do. I'm following a method from Chef Brandon and the American Culinary Federation. It's simpler, easier, not as many steps, and I think what you're left with is more like a candy than a pickled sweet pepper. The first difference is in how we cut the jalapeno. Now, I'm just going to slice off the stem. We're not going to use that. Most of the recipes call for making a slice that's about 1/4 inch thick, but I want this to be like a bite-sized candy. So, as with the American Culinary Federation method, we're cutting it thicker into about 1/2 inch slices. Now, you may have noticed that I'm not using gloves. Totally a personal choice, but for the most part, I'm only handling the outside of these peppers. The capsaicin that can burn your skin and make it uncomfortable is on the inside. So as I cut these peppers, I'm doing all I can to avoid contacting that. Now, picking it up with the knife helps. I am touching with my fingertips, and if you're concerned about burning fingertips, you might want to wear a glove for this part of the process. Now, this is a little time consuming, and so I'll go ahead and continue to cut these peppers, and when we're done, I'll be back. The jalapenos are cut. Now it's time for the other ingredients. I'm going to be using some of this wonderful, delicious purple striped garlic that I grew. This is the kind of recipe that allows for some modification. The main recipe calls for 3 pounds of jalapenos, but after measuring, I only have 2.5 pounds, but that's not a problem. That just means I'll be left with some extra syrup at the end after I put this Cowboy candy into jars. I'm going to use that extra syrup, so be sure you stick around to the end of the video for an extra bonus recipe to see how I use that syrup in a delicious vinaigrette. The recipe also calls for 3 teaspoons of granulated garlic. Well, granulated garlic is fine, but if you like really good flavor and you just happen to grow your own garlic, I encourage that you use your own fresh garlic. So I'm mincing 6 cloves, and I'll add this garlic to the jalapenos. It doesn't need to be minced very fine. This is going to be candied along with the peppers. So if there's some bigger chunks of garlic, it's perfectly fine. Different jalapenos will have different levels of heat, And I encourage that you taste your jalapenos to see what that level is. I did that. I tasted a few and they're mildly hot. And I want a nice, spicy, hot Cowboy candy. The recipe calls for adding 1 teaspoon of red pepper flakes to get that extra heat. Well, I just happen to grow my own cayenne peppers and dry them, and so I'm going to use my own cayenne pepper flakes. But to get that little extra heat, instead of 1 teaspoon, I'm going to be using 2 teaspoons. This also adds a nice contrasting color. Another way to get some color is with turmeric. Now the recipe does call for half a teaspoon of turmeric, and its primary purpose is to add some color to this Cowboy candy. I haven't noticed any difference in the taste when you leave it out, and I don't think it needs that extra color, so I'm not adding the turmeric. I'm also not adding celery seed. The recipe calls for half a teaspoon of the celery seed as well. And again, it will flavor it slightly. I haven't noticed much difference when I leave it out, so I'm just going with my fresh ingredients. And now it's time to make the syrup. I have 6 cups of sugar, and to that I'm adding 2 cups of cider vinegar. I've turned the heat on to about medium-high, and now I'm going to stir the sugar and the vinegar together until the sugar completely dissolves. Both the vinegar and the sugar act as preservatives with these peppers. Now, during this whole process, I've had the jars I'm going to be using for canning warming up. Within the last 10 years, some of the recommendations for home canning have changed. If you're going to be processing the jars for 10 minutes or more, you don't need to sterilize them ahead of time. Now, I live at high altitude, so I always have a long processing time, and I've never sterilized the jars. You don't need to sterilize the bands because these aren't exposed to any of the food. Just clean and wash them. And as for the lids, well, the way the lids are made now, you can keep these at room temperature and then apply them to the jars when it's time to seal them. I do it the same way I've been doing it for almost 20 years now. So I do keep them in a small pot of warm water, but there's no need to sterilize the lids either. So now all we're going to do is continue heating this syrup and waiting for the sugar to dissolve. The sugar has dissolved, and now I'm waiting for this to come to a boil. And this is where the processing differs from other videos that you might have seen. The typical way of doing this is to boil this and then let it simmer for 5 minutes, then add the peppers for 5 minutes, then put the peppers into the jars, leaving behind the liquid and letting it boil again for 5 minutes to thicken it. What I'm going to do now, it's boiling, start my timer, and I'm going to let this boil on the front end for 10 to 12 minutes. I'm going to cut out that last step of thickening the liquid at the end because we're thickening the liquid at the beginning. Chef Brandon says to boil this until it reaches a gooey consistency. Well, now at the 12-minute point exactly, it's a pretty thick syrup. I can see that it's beginning to sheet a little bit on the spoon. And so it's up to you as to how gooey you want it to be. I'm going to let it go just a little bit beyond the 12-minute point right now, so that this syrup is even a little bit thicker than this. So this actually looks pretty thick to me. So I'm going to go ahead now and add the jalapenos, garlic, and red pepper, and stir everything to be well coated. And I'll let this cook, looking at the timer, for 5 minutes. I let the temperature come up, and they've been simmering for 5 minutes. They'll change color. They'll lose their bright green color, and they'll start soaking up all this syrup. At this point, let's turn off the heat. Now there's a very strong aroma of jalapenos in the air, so if you don't like that smell, or you think it might pose some breathing difficulties, definitely open a window, open a door, turn a fan on, and get some ventilation in your kitchen. The peppers are done. I'm going to go ahead and get my jars and start the canning process. Now you could stop here. You don't have to can this Cowboy candy. You can pour it into bowls to cool. You can just keep it in the refrigerator, but for long-term storage, water bath canning is the way to go. So with the jar lifter, I'm going to take out one of my half-pint jars and fill it. I keep my jars in this pot of hot water not for the sterilization, but because this sugar syrup is volcano hot. And so by putting this into hot jars, I'm less likely to cause a problem with the jar cracking. So hot solution into a hot jar, fewer problems. With my ladle, I'm going to pour off most of the liquid and then pour the jalapenos into the jar. Pouring off liquid, pouring the jalapenos into the jar. As it gets mostly full, I'm going to tamp down and remove the funnel. See how full the jar is? I'll go ahead and add a few more jalapenos and also some syrup at this point. I'll dip down to get just the syrup and pour it into the jar. And I'm looking to get to the point that I have between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch of head space in this jar. That's the space between the top of the liquid and the bottom of the jar lid. And so with this, I'm also trying to get as much of the air bubbles out as possible. This actually looks pretty good. I think I'll add just a little more of the syrup, and then we'll clean off the top of the jar. And this one looks like it's complete. With a moist paper towel, I'm cleaning off the top of the jar. If you take your time and use a canning funnel, there isn't much cleanup when it comes time to seal the jar. And then I'll take a band and a lid to seal it. The first step is to take the lid and place it on the jar. Take the band, tighten it just finger tight, and the jar is very hot. And then we'll take our jar lifter and set it into our hot water. I was able to fill 2 of the 1/2 pints and 4 of the 4-ounce jars with my delicious Cowboy candy. Now I'm going to put the lid on and wait for it to reach a full rolling boil. Once it reaches a full rolling boil, we can begin our timer. We want to process these jars for 10 minutes at sea level. And you're going to want to modify that with altitude. For me, at 7,000 feet elevation, I add 15 minutes to that base time. So I set my timer for 25 minutes. Once the timer goes off, I turn off the heat, lift the lid, and then let this sit for a couple minutes as the boiling stops. And so the water's not splashing around. Let's take out these jars. They're very hot. I'm going to set them to the side on my dry towel. You don't want to place them on a wet towel. That could cause problems with cracking. Over the course of the next 5 to 10 minutes, you'll probably hear some pings. That's the lid actually sealing to the jar. That's a good sound. The jars are going to sit undisturbed over in that corner until tomorrow. Now, visually, I've already recognized that all of the jars have sealed, but I'm not going to test it. I'm not going to try to pry the tops to check for sure. I'll wait to do that until tomorrow. If you're new to water bath canning and preserving using this method, I suggest getting a book like this, the Ball Blue book. Everything I've talked about, including the time variations based on your elevation, is in this book. It's a great way to start, and I'll put a link to it below. I didn't take all the jalapenos and all the syrup and put them into jars. I put some of them into this plastic container, and now I'll put this in the refrigerator to cool and do a taste test a little bit later on. Once I had all the jalapenos out of the pot, I went ahead and poured the liquid into this measuring cup for the recipe that I'm going to be doing next. All the little bits of garlic and red pepper flakes have, for the most part, sunk to the bottom, but this is beginning to gel as it cools. So if I stir everything up, it really slows down how much they sink, and for the most part, they remain in solution. That's important for this next step, because I'm going to make a vinaigrette using this liquid, and having those little bits of candied garlic are going to be great. Now, a basic vinaigrette is essentially half a cup of olive oil and about 3 to 4 tablespoons of vinegar mixed with, in this case, I'm going to add a little bit of Dijon mustard. And that's it. Well, this is an incredibly sweet and spicy blend that already has the vinegar in it. So I'm going to go ahead and begin by taking my half cup of olive oil and putting it into this small mixing bowl. Then I'm going to take, in this case, 4 of these tablespoons of this vinegar, sugar, garlic, pepper solution. Was that 3 or 4? Let's do another one. And then I'm going to take this mustard and add it to the blend. 1 tablespoon. And then I'll whisk it all together. There's no reason to waste this liquid. Because I didn't have as many peppers, I had more left over. If you use the full 3 pounds of jalapeno peppers, you probably won't have as much left over, but you'll still have enough to make a beautiful and delicious vinaigrette. And so this has come together quite well. Let's go ahead and do a taste test. Oh wow, it's nice. It's sweet, slight taste of the jalapeno comes through, and a very little bit of the heat. By itself, I've tasted this. By itself, this is pretty hot and spicy, but when blended with the mustard and the olive oil, it's really good. So I know tonight I'm going to make a salad with some of the lettuce and the cucumbers and the tomatoes from my garden, and this is what's going on top. Let's go ahead and fast forward to tomorrow, and we'll check to see how the seals look on these jars and get ready for the final stage. The jars have been sitting overnight, and before we taste this delicious cowboy candy, let's do a quick inspection of these jars. You can tell visually when you have a good seal, but I always run my finger over this. These lids begin as convex, and then during the processing they get sucked into the jar, and then they form a concave surface. If you push and it pushes up and down, it's not a good seal. But if it's solid, everything is exactly the way it should be. And so now these jars can be stored at room temperature for up to about a year. If there isn't a good seal, they still will store in the refrigerator easily for 3 to 4 months. It's a good idea to take the bands off when you store your jars. They can rust on the inside, so if you're planning long-term storage for this and you live in a region with a lot of humidity, go ahead and take the bands off just so they don't rust to the top. And now let's go ahead and taste our cowboy candy. It's sticky, it's got that syrup on it. The sweetness comes out right away, and then the heat builds. Because we cooked all this together, the hotter jalapenos definitely made the more mild jalapenos hotter. So the whole thing has a pretty consistent heat to it. And this is pretty spicy, which tells me some of my jalapenos were pretty hot. I can pick up a little bit of the garlic. In fact, just tasted a piece of the garlic, which was really good. And I think one of the reasons this may be a little hotter is because of those cayenne flakes, but this is delicious and definitely something I'll be serving as a condiment. If you want to see more about preserving your harvest, watch this video next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.